PSG are very good, but they're not unbeatable. So, how do you beat them? Well, to dig deep in search of some weaknesses as we approach the Champions League quarter-finals, I'm joined by Alex Barker and John Mackenzie. So Alex, for a lot of Premier League fans like myself, the last we will have seen of PSG would have been their humbling of Chelsea in the previous round of the Champions League and maybe last season when they demolished Inter in the final. But this season, have they remained at the same level? Catch us up to speed.
I think it's been quite an underwhelming season for PSG and across all competitions actually. If we start with the Champions League, for example, they lost to Sporting and Bayern in the league phase, which meant for the second season in a row, they went into the playoff round of the Champions League and they very narrowly scraped past Monaco in that playoff round. Also, in the league, they've been slightly underwhelming as well. I've got their points after 26 Ligue matches across seasons. And this season, you've seen it's a notable drop-off from the prior one. And it's actually the fourth lowest points total since 2016-17. And 2 of the 3 seasons below that points total, they actually lost Ligue 1. So that really illustrates how low it is at the moment. That might be down to their injuries. PSG haven't been hit in the same way as some Premier League clubs suffering ACL injuries, players being ruled out for an entire season. But it has affected them in quite a nuanced way in certain areas. For example, up front, we have Ousmane Dembele and Desiree Doue, 2 players who were superstars last season. They've had many periods out across the season, just little injuries, and that's affected their front line. They've had to field their second string attackers at times. Meanwhile, in midfield, Fabian Ruiz has had much longer periods out of the team. Combine that with João Neves also picking up some injuries, and Vitinha's basically had to play every minute, and I think that's affected his performances as the season's gone on. A similar thing's happened in defence. Achraf Hakimi is still PSG's only real recognised right back, and when he's been out through injuries and through the African Cup of Nations, Warren Zaïre-Emery's had to come in. Now, he's a 20-year-old midfielder who can deputise at right back. It's not his ideal position, yet he has had to play basically every game in Ligue 1. Now, these injuries might be the reason why, that as well as getting fewer points in Ligue 1, they're actually in a title race for once. Lens are only 1 point off them at the moment, and there's been many points in this season where they've actually led Ligue 1, particularly in the middle part where they went on a fantastic run.
And that's probably why they're so upset about this game against PSG being postponed, right? Which should give PSG a bit more rest and hopefully mitigate for them their injury situation, like you say, ahead of their game against Liverpool.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I will say it's probably worth having a little bit of a reality check at this point because it's very exciting to say PSG are in a title race. But Lens, if you look at the expected points, they have had quite a substantial overperformance, 10 points more than expected points suggest. So I think they probably won't be able to last until the end of the season, and that's mainly based on the quality they have. If you look at previous teams to beat PSG in Ligue 1, you think of Monaco, Kylian Mbappe straight away when he was breaking out. Put it this way, I'll be surprised if Lens beat PSG with Odsonne Edouard and Florian Thauvin up front.
Odsonne Edouard's a good player.
Yeah, still, PSG are clearly underperforming this season. They look a lot weaker than they did last year.
Okay, so they're not quite as flawless as last season. So John, if you were managing a team coming up against PSG in the Champions League, like Liverpool are, where would you look to target them to try and win?
I think the first thing I would say to any team trying to beat PSG would be to be brave and press high. And the reason why I think they should do that is because I think with PSG, sometimes the distances are too large. Because I think we talked about the way that PSG set up in possession quite a lot last season because they were quite unique, quite interesting. What we see from them is generally when they've got settled possession, you end up with this back three, usually centre-back and a full-back on one side, and then a player in front of them as well, a pivot player.
And that's normally what Mendes tucking in and then Vitinha in front, right?
Yeah, that's right. You would usually have Vitinha as the pivot player, Mendes on the inside, but other things can happen. So often you'll see Vitinha dropping into that back line, and that means that Mendes is then free to move forward. But if Vitinha leaves this spot, you always need to have the pivot player in front of them. So usually what will happen is one of the other centre midfielders will drop in. But this is the build-up unit. This unit is designed to help them get through lines of pressure, but it's also a rest defence unit as well. In case they lose the ball, they're well positioned to stop opponents from attacking. And then in front of them, you've got the pinners. Now the pinners, we see this happening with elite teams all the time, where you'll have 2 wide players usually, whose job is basically to stretch that back line out to create space that the players in the middle can then attack. So you usually have a winger. Actually, on this side, it's often Achraf Hakimi pushing up from fullback, in which case the winger on that side will come inside and play a bit more central. And then you'll have someone usually in the striker spot. Again, their job is to pin, but in a very different way. That's almost to force the back line deeper to, again, open out more space in the centre. And that leaves the rest of the players to be floaters, and that gives them a huge degree of flexibility. They can move around. Often what they're trying to do is pull man markers apart, pull defensive structures apart, show up to receive the ball from the build-up unit. But it's also worth saying that what's most important here really is the structure. It doesn't matter who's in each position, as long as those positions are filled. So, for example, we've talked already about Desiree Doué. He can play as a wide player, as a pinner. Sometimes he'll play inside as a floater from the same sort of basic starting position. That flexibility is built into the structure, and it's basically designed to be both structured but fluid and flexible at the same time.
Okay, so kind of the best of both worlds then. You mentioned distances earlier and that being a slight problem for them. Where do they arise within this structure?
I think one of the things that I've noticed, particularly this season, is that there's a tendency when PSG have possession of the ball and they're attacking, for all of their attacking players to get forward. After all, this is designed to be an aggressive system. You want to get as many players forward as possible. Sometimes if they then recycle the ball backwards, you can end up with massive distances between the defence and the midfield. So basically the build-up unit and everyone else. And I think when this happens, I think they actually become quite vulnerable, and that's why I'm saying, actually, if you can get them into these sorts of situations and press them up the pitch, it can be quite dangerous.
It feels like I often see Vitinha maybe looking for an escape route and having to run across quite a long distance with just him because he doesn't have that many passing options.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a sequence so you can see it happening on the field. Now, this is exactly what we were talking about. We've got PSG in settled possession, the ball with the centre-back, and the ball has been recycled back from a more advanced period of possession. And as you can see, I've drawn the lines here between that build-up unit of 3 and then all of the rest of the players, to the extent that they've not even got the pivot player in place at this point. And this becomes a problem because I think if you can then access this back 3 quite quickly, you can close down the passing lanes and you can close some of the passing options, some of the escapes, and it becomes very hard for them to get the ball forward. So as you can see, Vitinha receives the ball from the centre-back, and immediately we can see the front 3 from Monaco pressing right up, and we've got 2 things that are happening here. One is that all 3 of these players actually have man-to-man access to that back line of PSG, but also what they've done is they've stayed really compact. They've stopped the passing lanes into the middle. The other thing that's worth noting is that behind them, the rest of their teammates have made sure that there are no easy escape routes as well. So what's happened here is that you've closed off any potential escapes, you've made sure there's man-to-man access in behind that forward line, and it causes a lot of problems for PSG because what we see is Vitinha turns out to the left. And it's worth remembering that Vitinha is right-footed, so this is already going to be his weak side. So if there's not an easy option for them to escape, he's probably not going to take it. In this instance, there is actually a double movement that's happening here. This is something that PSG do a lot. So you can see you've got Kvaratskhelia running the line with the other player dropping in, and the idea here is to confuse these 2 man markers and end up with some kind of space. You can either play the short pass into the dropping player or the long pass into the channel. But in this instance, Vitinha decides against it, comes back inside, and again we can see that Monaco are covering all of the available options. So not only do we have man pressure on Vitinha here, you can see the other forward is able to cover that escape run that you've said that he does a lot, which is true. He will often run side to side until he finds an escape route. But we've also got him blocking the passing lane to Zabani, who's off the pitch here, and we also have the other forward who's able to jump onto the centre-back. So literally no easy escapes here. In the end, Vitinha turns back around, plays the ball out to Joe Fernandez, who lets the ball run across his body, but in doing so, because he's being man-marked, by the time he actually gets the ball to a position where he can play it, he's under pressure immediately. So he plays the ball back to Kvaratskhelia, he receives the ball, but he's immediately under man-man pressure. In the end, all he can do is drop back down the line, and even in this situation, there's no easy escape, and in the end, what we actually get is Kvaratskhelia doing a Cruyff turn straight out of play, and they win the ball back. So I think it's very clear from this game against Monaco that if you are actually brave and you're able to step up the field and you're able to cover all of the man options around the ball, then you can actually cause PSG a huge amount of problems. Actually, in this game, Monaco were able to generate attacks from these kind of moments where they turn the ball over. And I think for any elite side, where they're probably going to be using high man-to-man pressing, this is going to be a really useful tool, I think, to break PSG down.
Yeah, I was going to say, because loads of elite teams play this aggressively without the ball, right? So if you're PSG, why do they allow these big distances to develop in the first place when, pardon my ignorance, but maybe why don't they bring a couple of midfielders a bit deeper to help with those escape routes?
If you were to look at any other elite team in build-up phases, most of them are doing the opposite, right? Making those distances smaller, particularly around the back line, because if you make those distances smaller, it can be much easier to beat man-to-man pressure. But I think this is intentional on the part of PSG because they have such good players in that back line, particularly Vitinha, who is basically a cheat code when it comes to these things. And the trade-off goes in the other direction, right? If you only need to build up with 3 in the back line and then 1 in front of them, it means they've got 6 players further up the pitch that makes them really dangerous in these sorts of positions. So I've got a nice example from a game against Nice recently where we see exactly this thing happening. So we're in the same situation. PSG have the ball, they're playing in white now. There's your back three and your pivot in front of them. And again, the distances are massive between that line of three and the players in front of them. Nice are going to try and do the jump up high and make sure you cause them problems, but the distance of this forward for Nice is so much that by the time Vitinha receives the ball, you can see that player has got nowhere near him. So what Vitinha can actually do here is he can pick his head up, he has a few touches, but when he plays this pass, if we zoom out in the aftermath of this pass, we can see that he's actually been able to make the most of that double movement that we talked about before with one of the players dropping in. I think this is Menz running through further ahead of him, and he's actually able to find that pass through to him, and then they end up with this situation here where it's effectively 5-on-5 with the players available. They're attacking at speed, there's a lot of space, and when you have really elite players like this, you're going to score a lot of goals in this way. And so this is what PSG are trying to do. They want to have those big distances because it does open out the pitch. It makes it easier for them to generate goals if they can get through it. I think that this is the risk of if you're going aggressive at them, if you get it wrong, even if it's just a couple of times, they can really punish you.
Okay, so it's a game of chicken where PSG kind of rely on their more talented individuals for the advantage at the other end of the pitch. So if you don't feel brave enough as a coach to take that approach, what's the alternative?
The distances can be advantageous if you're good at pressing, but if you're not going to be as good at pressing, then just don't allow them the ability to hit those artificial transition moments. And I've just got a nice example of this. What we've got is PSG in settled possession, but quite high up the pitch. And what Chelsea have done is they've just fallen back into a block. It's quite an active block, so the players within the block are making sure that they're not just static and they're just in rows. So you can see there's man marking going on in the middle of the block. You can see this player here is stepping out of the block to put pressure on the ball carrier. But what's really interesting for me here is that we talked about it before with the anchors and floaters. Often what you see with PSG is them getting these floaters in the centre of the pitch, creating all of these like rotations and movements to pull opponents' defensive structures apart. But actually what I've noticed, particularly this season, is when teams fall into those blocks, we're not seeing as much of that happening within these smaller spaces. So in this example here, you can see there's only one PSG player inside the block. We can see the midfielder here has dropped out, and as a result what you've got essentially is a lot of PSG players outside the block and then a few of them around the edges, a pinner here forcing that back line back potentially, but they're not actually building through the middle in this situation. Now there's a trade-off here, right, because Chelsea are so narrow that they're allowing spaces around the edge. They've got really nice access. If they want to pass from one side to the other, they can do that. But yes, you're giving good access to the wide players. But in this instance, Cucurella is immediately on the wide player when they receive the ball. And we can see there's another player giving back up here. So you're effectively doubling up on this player. And yes, as we've said before, there's a really easy escape route around to the other side, which is what happens with PSG in this example. But again, by the time the wide player is accessed, this is Nuno Menz. You can see Pedro Neto immediately on him. But with Kvaratskhelia, who's maybe the winger that you would be worried about here, you can see that not only is he being man-marked, but the other forward is dropping in to help out to make sure he's doubled up on as well. So when they're playing against compact defences, obviously all teams are going to struggle more against compact defences than open defences. But when they are playing up against them, they actually look much less dangerous, in my opinion. Now, they still have incredible players who can still break that block down through long shots or set pieces or just having really good small space players. But I do think this is an area where actually if you want to low block and counter against PSG in the later rounds, that's actually a good way of doing it. We've already seen Chelsea do it in the Club World Cup where they basically played quite, I would say, reactive football and then hit them on the break. That's going to cause them problems. But just one more point from this sequence, because I found this really interesting, because what we've started seeing PSG doing is trying to set up the conditions that are better for them. So actually a few seconds later from here, we end up with PSG having retained possession of the ball back where we were talking about before. There's your three, there's your pivot in front of them, a lot more spaces between the lines. And actually in this instance, they end up getting the ball to Warren Zaire-Emery, who's dropped out to form that back three. And now, again, double movements. These are the situations they like to generate. In this instance, actually the wide player who receives the ball, he can play the ball back into Zaire Emery's feet, and then they end up in this situation where you can see they've dispersed the block, they've opened it out, they're able to attack at speed. They're now in the same sort of situation for the Nice goal that we saw before. So I think this is the big danger that you're going to get when you're playing against PSG and trying to block out, is that they are going to do this sort of decompression as well as compression. Whenever the block gets too tight, they're going to say, fine, we're not going to have any joy here, let's start it again, let's see if we can tempt them out, let's see if we can create that space and play through them.
Yeah, it feels like they tricked Chelsea into pressing them without really Chelsea wanting to, and then exploited that space, like you say, through their more talented players, one of whom, of course, is Ousmane Dembele. Won the Ballon d'Or last season, scored a ton of goals. This season, you alluded to it earlier with his injuries in patches, not having quite as good a year?
Absolutely not. I think across the league and Champions League, there's been a notable drop-off. I've got his Champions League numbers in front of me, and you can see in basically every metric, there's been a drop-off from last season. Obviously, it's a small sample size, but I think from watching him, I've worked out what's happening. It's worth remembering what Dembele did so well last season. After the halfway point of the campaign, he got moved into a central role by Luis Enrique. And in this role, obviously he's not a player to bulldoze centre-backs. Instead, what he did so well was rotate with other players and drop into pockets around the back line. And in these areas, Dembele is incredibly dangerous because he has the speed to race in behind back lines and get on the end of early crosses, but he's also got the technical ability to receive the ball, take a defender on, and carve out a shooting opportunity for himself. And if you look at his ball receipts, or where he received the ball on the pitch, last season you can see he was often receiving it inside the opposition penalty box, pretty close to goal. But this season you can see he's actually receiving it quite a bit further away from goal. And I think there's two reasons for that. The first one is obviously people are aware of what Dembele is now. He was kind of a surprise last season. I think teams know what to expect and are a bit more aware of him. But also what John was talking about, PSG seem to be struggling to get through compact defences. So I think Dembele's had to drop a bit deeper to try and collect the ball.
I think the goal from last season that really stands out for me that PSG scored was the one against Arsenal, where you actually get exactly what we're talking about, right, with the back three super deep, but they open out space on the far side of the pitch, and Mendes plays that ball into Dembele in space. They're able to open out that space, and then he goes from there. And I wonder whether or not what we're seeing this season is that teams are just not allowing those spaces as much as they were last season, and so as a result he's having to pick the ball up in often quite different circumstances.
Mm-hmm. So on that note, if we're bringing it back to ways to beat PSG, Dembele is still the Ballon d'Or winner, and it's worth saying, you know, I've watched all of these shots this season. I think he's still clearly one of, if not the best players in the world. His goal against Lille was probably my goal of the season for me so far. But as John's saying, if you can keep him further away from goal, making sure he's receiving the ball in these deeper areas, it just increases the distance for him to travel to goal, either by running towards goal, getting in behind, or by giving him too many defenders to take on that not even Dembele can beat.
Okay, so we've spoken about their attack a lot and maybe how to limit the impact of Dembele. What about at the other end of the pitch? I know they changed goalkeepers in the summer. What's been happening there?
Maybe the simplest way to beat PSG is to just take a lot of shots, because goalkeeper is a position they're very fragile in at the moment. So last summer, as you mentioned, PSG changed goalkeeper. They sold Gianluigi Donnarumma and brought in Lucas Chevalier. And the reasoning for this was pretty explicit from Luis Enrique. It was a change of profile. Donnarumma, a fantastic shot stopper, right? But he's not so good with his feet. Chevalier from Lille, you know, he's very good with the ball at his feet. He's played for France due to that ability. But on the shot-stopping side, he's not quite as good. In fact, I found it quite fun watching him because he's a player I've scouted a year ago, and The Athletic actually published a piece on him a couple of years ago. And in both of our notes and this season, the same issues with Chevalier in terms of shot-stopping keep cropping up. And I think the thing that really cost him this season was his handling. Chevalier has a bad habit of spilling shots into central areas. The last goal he conceded for PSG was against Sporting in the Champions League. It's in the 90th minute. Sporting players just on the edge of the box. He's going to take a shot. It's straight at Chevalier. And you think at this point, great, just claim it, maybe launch a counter-attack. Instead, he fumbles it right in front of goal, allowing Luis Suarez, not that one, to jump in, head the ball straight into the bottom corner, and Sporting end up winning the game. So I mentioned this was the last goal he conceded for PSG because he's not started for PSG since January. Matthew Safanov has come in instead, the backup goalkeeper, and well, he's a backup goalkeeper for a reason. He's not especially bad, but he's not especially good. So if you want to beat PSG, might just be worth taking lots of long shots and testing the goalkeeper.
It's like when Man City got rid of Joe Hart, replaced him with Claudio Bravo before they eventually landed on Edison, right?
Yeah.
They're in the Bravo stage right now. John, Alex has mentioned some defensive issues there, specifically with the keeper. But what about the collective off the ball? As our out of possession king, what have you noticed when it comes to their press and their defending?
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing about PSG is that a lot of the time they are very man-oriented. We talk about man marking a lot in the modern game, particularly with elite teams. But I think what we see from some of the really elite teams like Bayern, but also from PSG as well, is that they will actually be quite aggressive and just go man-to-man across the pitch. There's one problem when you go man-to-man across the pitch, and that is that you're pressing 11 players with 10 because you don't press with your own goalkeeper. And so what that actually means is that if you are playing against a team who are going to be super aggressive with their man marking,
you need to press with your goalkeeper as well.
That's exactly the takeaway I was going to do. No, the point is there's always going to be a free player that you can manipulate in some way. And actually, I think we've started seeing teams doing this. Got a really nice example from Rennes in Ligue 1. In the first half in particular, they caused a lot of problems for PSG because they knew where the free player was going to be and they used that to great effect. and it allowed them to just play through the PSG press quite a lot. Now in this instance, Rennes are going to play the ball back to their goalkeeper. I think what's really interesting here is that we can see that Dembele here is going to be really aggressive and press onto the goalkeeper. Now as we've said, there's going to be a free player somewhere, and that means that it's actually Dembele's player who becomes free. The problem that needs to be solved by Rennes then is how do we get the ball to this centre-back. In the end, the way that they do that is by having this pivot player dropping in. Yes, he's under pressure because it's man-man across the pitch, but when you're receiving a ball and you have the ability to play a first-time pass into this amount of space, it becomes much easier. So essentially what they do is they play what's almost like a third-man combination, you'd call it, where it's one player passes it to another who passes it to another. This opens out a huge amount of space for PSG, because what ends up happening is that Dembele tries to get back to his player, but that player has received it so far in advance that he can't actually manage to get there on time. So what happens here is that you start seeing this chain of events where the marking system just falls to pieces because everyone has to start covering for someone else. So in this instance, you've got Kvaratskhelia coming across to make sure that the centre-back can't run through the middle. In doing so, he's creating a free player, right? So now, new puzzle to be solved. How do you access this free player? And again, they do it in pretty much the same way, which is a dropping player, losing their man marker, and then playing the bounce pass into the free man over here. And again, you've now just got through their lines of pressure quite easily. You've got to the halfway line. You're actually up against their back line. And what we see the Rennes players doing is these nice double movements again, where you're trying to pull certain players forward, push other players back and get in behind them. In this case, you've got a player dropping off the back line to drag the centre-back with them, opening out the space behind them, and then the two Rennes players ready to access that space. Now, I think he plays the wrong pass, the player on the ball here, because he plays it into the feet of the dropping player, and this player takes a couple of touches, and by the time he actually gets the ball out of his feet, the player that he plays it to, one of these two, is offside. But if you play the ball into the channel, it's going to cause a huge amount of problems. And actually, the first goal that Rennes scored in this game was playing a channel ball in behind that was actually scored from. So man marking is great if you can get away with it, but it can be manipulated, and I think there will be teams in the Champions League good enough to actually find these kinds of solutions.
So how are the actual defenders individually handling that?
Well, it's interesting because I think Luis Enrique has coached quite a specific approach in these scenarios where the rest of the team pushes up and maybe there are players free between the lines. And the instruction seems to be for the centre-backs to step up very, very aggressively and make sure there is nobody free. Now, this is an incredibly risky approach, even when you have Marquinhos in your team, who I think is one of the best centre-backs in the world. He provides a lot of experience. Even in the Champions League, PSG can leave some gaps when he's in the team. But when he's not playing, oh wow, they leave so many gaps, particularly when it's Ilya Zabani and William Pacho playing together. Both defenders are pretty aggressive in the way they play, and I just don't think they play very well together. And I've got some examples of that from PSG's recent game against Nice. And I do want to add a bit of context. Nice are essentially the French Tottenham. They've woefully underperformed this season. They're a bit of a mess. They're managed by Claude Puel, and they still managed to cause PSG a ton of problems.
But they've got a nice stadium.
So here's the first example. I've highlighted Pacho and Zabani. Nice have the ball in defence, and they're just going to play it out wide. And when this happens, Nice's forward here is just going to drop out and Pacho is going to follow him. Sorry for the great big scoreline over here, but this should be the cue for Zabani over here to come across and cover the middle because Pacho is getting dragged out wide. Instead, he just doesn't notice this or he doesn't recognise the cue. So this huge gap opens out between the defenders, allowing Nice just to run straight through. The ball gets flicked in. Nice can run straight through the middle, basically one-on-one, and the only reason a 1v1 situation doesn't form is because PSG are forced into a tactical foul. The next example, if we bring it back to how to beat PSG, maybe how to make the most of these gaps, Nice do employ quite a clever tactic, I think. So you can see that you've got the two centre-backs ahead of Nice's striker who's hanging offside. The ball gets played into midfield, and this player just next to the referee drops in to receive the ball. Now this is the cue, as we mentioned before, for the PSG centre-backs, one of them to step up. There's a player free between the lines, that can't happen. Probably not ideal for both centre-backs to step up, which is what happens, leaving the Nice striker who was offside to creep back onside. And if this player on the ball can just thread it through, again, it's a 1v1 situation with no centre-back in the way to stop it.
Because Zaire Emery's playing in one side, right? Poor Zaire Emery's having to play at right back. He doesn't jump either, right?
Yeah, he's not going to escape criticism. And they're very lucky in this situation because Nice end up playing the ball out wide. But while you've mentioned Zaire Emery, let's go on to the final example, because you're right, it's not just the centre-backs at fault when PSG can't play their first choice team. Hakimi has been out at points this season, Zaire Emery's had to fill in, and one mistake he keeps making, I think, he just loses his marker when he's pushed up for the attack. So he's on the far side of the screen. This Nice player you can see is about to run in behind. They have the ball with their right wing back. And this should be the cue for Zaire Emery to start retreating because the centre-backs are going to get dragged across. No, he doesn't recognise the cue because the ball reaches the right wing back, he carries it forward and plays the ball in behind, and you can see the gap start opening out. Once the ball actually reaches the striker, there's like a 20-metre gap here from Zaire Emery, who's completely lost his marker. He's very fortunate Zabani gets across and just blocks off the pass, because if he doesn't, it's another 1v1 chance where there's no one in the way to stop it. So it is worth saying that I think this is slightly lessened when Marquinhos and Hakimi are playing, but it really goes to show when they're playing their second choice defenders, PSG leave a ton of exploitable gaps.
It's interesting as well because they're playing a man-man system. Often you can lose touch with your back line when that happens because the players are player-oriented rather than sticking in that sort of solid line where you can step up and back and you manipulate the line as and when you need it. In this instance, part of the problem is you've got like fullbacks running in behind, which means that they may end up in advance of the centre-backs who will think we're the line of the offside, but then because they're not doing that, a striker who's drifted off them will suddenly be onside again as well. So the man-man approach, I think, has a lot of weaknesses for them that at the moment they're not mitigating particularly well.
Okay, so will there be any of these elite defenders missing for the Liverpool game?
Not as it stands, but as we were saying, right, if any of those defenders drop out or any other player in the PSG team drops out because it's so reliant on individuals making the system work, it could cause big issues and give Liverpool or whoever faces them in future the opportunity to win the game.
Hope you're watching, Arne Slot.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football.